Ann Arbor's Talk Station, 1290 WLBY, exploring design and its impact in our life each week with Damien Farrell from Damien Farrell Design Group, local architect here in Ann Arbor. Good morning to you, sir.
Good morning. How are you this morning?
Nice to have you back with us as we
Always great to be here.
Look at design in a myriad of things. I mean, design impacts everything we do.
Everything in our lives.
And
everything in our lives, yeah.
It's something that people maybe don't readily think about until it doesn't work for them.
Yeah, good point. Until I go to city council meeting.
Yeah, that's right. We have a very special guest today. He is a Pulitzer Prize winning architecture critic of the Chicago Tribune as we welcome in Blair Kamin. And you have been at the Trib, since 1992, Blair?
Actually, 1987, and I've been the architecture critic since 1992.
Well, welcome to the show. Great to have you on with us today.
It's great to have you, Blair. Thank you so much.
It's great to be here. I love Ann Arbor, and it's great to be able to reach listeners there.
How did this happen for you with the Chicago Tribune job and your role as architecture critic?
Well, that's a long story. The short version is that I took a class in college on Gothic architecture. It really inspired me, got me interested in the field. I was entranced by great cathedrals like Chartres and Amiens.
Yeah.
I explored the field. I decided whether I should be a practicing architect or a writer. I knew at one point when someone said that one of my drawings looked like naive art that I had made the right decision to be a writer, and set my sails on Chicago because it's a great center of design and architecture, and was lucky enough to be able to pursue that.
And he joins us this morning on 1290 WLBY, Blair Kamin of the Chicago Tribune.
Blair, you've just gone through an extraordinary exercise here of writing 3 articles. Am I right in understanding that it came out as 3 separate publications, if you will, or articles on...
Yeah, it was a 3-part series called Designed in Chicago, Made in China. They came out on 3 separate days in the newspaper, and they were actually published simultaneously, all at once online.
Well, they're fascinating. Work, play, live. And it's an extraordinary connection between the history of Chicago and how that it went through with its boom and its growth, and what the architects and designers in Chicago are doing now, and how that has all exported to China.
Exactly. Chicago was really the great American boomtown of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It grew at lightning speed after the Chicago fire from roughly 300,000 to 2 million between 1871 and 1910. So what's fascinating now is that the city's architects are exporting their expertise in skyscrapers, museums, and other buildings to China, which is the boom country of the early 21st century. The statistics of China's boom are staggering.
Aren't they just?
Right now, more than 700 million people live in Chinese cities, and it's expected by experts that another 300 million will join them by 2030, meaning that by that year, 1 billion people will live in Chinese cities, 1 of every 8 people on Earth. So this is really rapid urbanization. It dwarfs in scale and scope anything else.
And how thoughtful is the planning for that, for those people?
It isn't particularly thoughtful. The emphasis has really been one-dimensional. It's been on shifting people from farms to cities to improve the state of the Chinese economy, which is now the world's second largest economy after the United States. So this is, on the one hand, raised 500 million people out of poverty, but on the other hand, it's spawned dystopian living conditions. Pea soup skies, just absolutely awful pollution, rigid, monotonous housing blocks that are something out of an Orwellian fantasy, and sterile business districts that are full of iconic trophy-like skyscrapers but really have very little life to them on the ground. So it's very much a mixed bag, and the architects from Chicago are really, they're happy that they have the work in China. It helped get them through the recession. And they're also happy because the Chinese love to spend money on big, showy buildings. But they're often disappointed by the outcome of their work because they don't have full control over it. In China, American architects and other architects from other countries cede control over the final blueprints to Chinese architects.
Right.
And more important, they don't have control over the patterns of urban growth that the Chinese are following, and those often are very anti-urban. I mean, Wang Shu, who's a Chinese architect who won the Pulitzer Prize, the highest architectural honor in 2012, said that, China once had great cities, and now it's turning every city into like a vertical suburb with wide roads, sterile housing blocks, very little history, just kind of a scorched earth policy of cleaning the slate and letting developers have at it.
Even in Ann Arbor, we think about those kinds of things, livable, walkable downtown, for instance, and the process that goes into that to make sure that your community looks how you want it to look in the future. Why in China aren't they putting that same thought process together when it comes to how they build their homes and their businesses and shopping areas?
You mean the People's Republic of Ann Arbor is actually a more vibrant place than the
We've been
People's
outed.
Republic of China?
That was precisely the connection I was trying to make.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that the Chinese have been influenced in part by Soviet-style urban planning, which has pushed the creation of very large-scale urban squares like Red Square in Moscow, and then of course Tiananmen Square in Beijing. There's that. Then there's, I think there's other factors too. I mean, you get the feeling that they just haven't really focused in on the smaller aspects of urbanism that can make cities livable. And this is really ironic because, they're importing some of the worst mistakes that America has made, and yet they have their own civilization which stretches back, thousands of years. It has a rich history of urban design. The great example of this is in Beijing. There are these alleys called hutang, and the alleys are framed by courtyard houses. And if you walk down one of these, they're wonderful. I mean, the sounds of the city fade away. Everyone's walking. People are out in the alleys. There's a communal life there. People play mahjong, or they gossip, or kids play. But in other words, these houses, some of which are hundreds of years old, lack modern conveniences. So people want to leave them for new apartment blocks that have showers and elevators and electricity and other things. And the Chinese have just been, there's something called Chinese speed, where, like if you leave your village for like 6 months and you come back, there'll be like 10 new skyscrapers that were built, in the interim. And I'm not kidding. I mean, it really stuff like this really happens that fast. And so, there's been a real emphasis on, fast, quick, building stuff, moving people, making targets, but little thought given to the, to the quality of life. And I should say that even the Chinese think this. I mean, one of the highlights for me of the series was seeing a movie called Spicy Love Soup that was made in 1997. There's a scene in the movie where two lovers, go to their apartment, a guy's apartment in one of the Beijing or one of the Chinese housing developments. The next morning, she goes out for breakfast. She gets some breakfast, and then she gets lost because she can't find her way back to his apartment building. It's one of, an endless stretch of look-alike apartment buildings, and she knocks on the door and, of one apartment, and, instead of her handsome lover, some old guy in a T-shirt answers the door. And then, she knocks on another door, and, a little child and her mother answer, and, at the end, she's lost in the concrete forest, and is one of the experts I consulted on this, a Beijing native who teaches now here in Chicago, said that even love was lost in this monotonous sea of concrete high-rises. So I think that really, gets to what's going on here. You talk about how design affects our lives, and this is how design can really extinguish a sense of place and really dim the human spirit. I mean, these are, there are material advantages to these buildings. Clearly, they're an advance. People are moving on up, as it were, like the Jeffersons in the old TV series, but there are real disadvantages. And these buildings are also often located on the fringes of cities, so they lack access to schools and hospitals, according to studies. They encourage car use. People are lacking access to jobs, so it's very tough. And while China doesn't have the vast slums that you might see in India or Africa, it has its own urban dystopian conditions.
Talking with Blair Kamin of the Chicago Tribune on Damian on Design with Damien Farrell from Damien Farrell Design Group on the Lucy Ann Lance Show, Ann Arbor's talk station, 1290 WLBY. You write, Blair, great cities aren't just about iconic skyscrapers. They're about the spaces in between them. And that's
Absolutely.
Something that seems to have been forgotten also in China.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, if you think about Ann Arbor, one of the great spaces on the campus, right? Is it the Diagrid? Is that what
Yes.
it's called?
The Diag, yeah.
The Dyad, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a space where it's a quad. It's like a quad. It's a void in the campus, and that is framed by some terrific buildings. But the real focus there is the empty space where people gather and enliven that space with activity. So I think that's what's often missing in China. For example, the leading example of this is in Shanghai. There's an area called Pudong, and it's the financial district of Shanghai. 30 years ago, there were a bunch of warehouses and squatters shacked there, maybe some rice fields. Now you have an incredible collection of skyscrapers that include the world's only collection, or trio, I should say, of super tall skyscrapers, 3 towers, including one that's more than 2,000 feet tall called the Shanghai Tower that's going to be finished next year. So when you look at this skyline from afar, it's incredible. It's all lit up at night. LEDs race up and down these buildings. It's kind of like Las Vegas meets Manhattan. And but when you get there, it's completely different. Each skyscraper sits isolated on a large block. There is a huge road that cuts through the center of the district. And so the end result feels something like Los Angeles or Houston, very car-oriented. I mean, the place was so unwalkable and so pedestrian unfriendly that they actually had to build a second-tier pedestrian bridge network, just so people could get from one building to the other. I mean, this is not a great way to build cities. That's a Band-Aid that you do afterwards. And I think that in building new cities in China, architects and urban planners from Chicago are trying to do different things, trying to make them more livable. I mean, just a couple of examples. Phil Enquist, an urban planner from Skidmore, Owings & Merrill here, walked Chinese officials from one city down North Michigan Avenue, the main retail street here, and it was he was saying to them, look, you can have a beautiful retail street that's very impressive and very walkable. It doesn't need to be 300 feet wide, like a Soviet boulevard, like 90 or 90 or 100 feet or whatever it is, much narrower is just fine.
Yeah.
So other urban designers are looking at live-work cities where apartment buildings would be located amidst skyscrapers. So people would only have to walk, say, 15 minutes to the farthest point in the city. I mean, this is so you could have great density, but in a size of a city not unlike Ann Arbor.
Yeah.
So those are pretty good models, I think.
So that wave is coming on now, because that was the big thing that that really stuck out for me when I read the articles was that we're exporting all this design and this technology for the tall buildings, but yet we're a country that has become so focused on our urban life. And we've actually, I think, shifted now. More people are moving back to cities, right? And this is such a huge focus in our cities and towns. And yet that doesn't seem to have made it over there. Is that just a lag? Is that just a natural progression?
I think that's a very good observation. Yes, I think there is. We're now, I think it's fair to say, in a kind of second generation of the Chinese urbanization and boom. And the second generation has somewhat more promise. I mean, I think there's been a widespread